Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is, to quote Popverse's Chris Arendt at the recent Meet the Press panel at Emerald City Comic Con, the most prominent writer about manga in America, including major pieces for Publishers Weekly, as well as an illustrator, a consultant, a journalist, and more. It's Deb Aoki. Thanks for coming on, Deb.
Well, thank you, David. This is really sweet of you to invite me.
Did I cover all of your hats correctly?
I'd say most of them, yes.
Most of them. We'll get those. We'll get to those in a little bit. But I did mention Emerald City Comic Con in my intro. I really want to ask about that because this is the first edition I think I've missed since 2016, save for 2020, which just didn't happen.
Wow.
How was it? How was the new building? Was it good?
The new building is beautiful. It's pretty spectacular. It's, 5 floors, or is it 6 if you count floor 0? It's got these beautiful windows and the sweeping view of Pine Street all the way down to the water. That's space to there's space for 2 LARPing areas. How epic is that? As well as a cosplay area and stuff like that. So it's a beautifully designed building. It's really nice and it's pretty brand new. Mm-hmm. There's I was in a write-up for the talkback session, and I said, well, there's more plugs and USB outlets than most U.S. airports in that building.
Wow. That's amazing.
Which, for a journalist, that is like, oh.
Yeah. I think the floor 0 thing is kind of funny. It's like, well, I never understand why they do things like floor 0. I mean, maybe it's because it's like a lower level, but why not just start that with that as 1? You're not going to do a lower level after that. I mean, it's like, why not 1 through 6? I don't know.
It is kind of the basement floor because when you walk in, you're in floor 1.
Mm-hmm.
Go down an escalator, 2 escalators down to the main show floor, which, I'll be blunt, was a Ghibli booth, a Bandai Namco booth, and a lot of swap meet.
Mm. Yeah.
You're like, cat ears, vaguely bootleg lenticular anime characters, posters.
I kind of feel like I love Emerald City Comic Con. It's kind of my home. I live in Anchorage, Alaska. We don't really have cons. And so that's the one I go to, and I kind of consider it my regional home con. Mm. But it has kind of had that swap meetish vibe the last few years on the main show floor. It's been interesting to see, but I have to admit, I know a lot of people didn't like the previous building because it was like an MC Escher building that has come to life, but I really enjoyed it. I figured out all the shortest paths, and I felt like my expertise it's all erased now. I'm going to come in next year, and I'm going to be the newbie when everybody else has fully figured it out. I'm going to be behind the 8 ball right now. It's terrible.
That's what Rob Salkowitz was saying. He's like, "Oh, all my my knowledge of how to navigate this building is just, the old building is completely gone," and he just felt kind of, I don't know, like his expertise was just chipped away a little bit.
We're gonna have to rebuild it, me and Rob. But you also just got back from Japan, so both of those trips are interesting because I imagine you're kind of like me, where when you go, it's like a mix of pleasure and business. Was that the case for both of those trips?
I'd say so, yeah. With the Japan trip, I went with the first half of the trip. I was there with Oriana Leckert and David Hyde, and they were there doing meetings for Kickstarter. Mm-hmm. And so we were kind of on this, meet and greet tour, I guess, talking with a bunch of manga publishers of different sizes, and just kind of getting to know each other. And so it was really interesting that way. And it was Oriana's and David's both of their first trip to Japan. Mm. Basically, I kind of came along as a tour guide, I guess, concierge, making sure they got on the trains all right.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I go typically, I don't want to make it sound like I'm bragging about it, but, before the pandemic, I was going twice a year.
Yeah.
And because it's so important for me to make and maintain these connections with people in the publishing industry there. And I get so much information and I learn so much every time I go. So, I just keep going back. And so, so I have deep empathy for people who go for the first time because, I think I've made every single travel mistake you can make in Japan. So my mission in life, I guess, for people I care about is, please don't make the same mistake. Well, I want to make your trip here as fun as possible. And I know that it's hard if you can't speak or read Japanese.
You're well versed in the do's and don'ts of Japan, it sounds like.
I still make mistakes though, because
Yeah.
rules change with time.
I went in 2011. It's the only time I've went. My wife is actually a quarter Japanese, and she
Wow.
lived there for 3 years. And
Mm,
it was when she was way younger, but she's visited a bunch of times. And I didn't go with my wife. I went right after the earthquakes in 2011, and
wow.
it was a really interesting time to be there. But there's some times where you're like, I feel like I'm nailing this, and then about 2 minutes later, you're like, I am not nailing this. And having somebody like you is, I imagine, would be an amazing guide. But I have to ask, you're saying about how keeping up with your contacts, like talking to people there,
Mm,
visiting with these people with Oriana and David and everything. You talked about this on the panel at Emerald City. You said that one of the tricky parts about like doing your work as a journalist and reporting on the business or medium side of manga is that it often happens in another language. So it's hard for you to get to that original story. Do
mhm.
trips like that, are those like advantageous for kind of keeping up with those types of things and kind of getting your the boots on the ground when it comes to the actual story?
It does help a lot. I've kind of nurtured a network of people and contacts in Japan who I can, say, what's, like that I can reach out to and go like, I just saw this and what's the deal with this?
Yeah.
Or like people in the internet, any manga blogging, Twittery, social media space are all talking about this. What's the story? How are you seeing this story on your side? Because it becomes kind of a telephone game, really. Like there's a lot of cases where something comes out of Japan, somebody translates it or interprets what was said, and then it just takes on a life of its own. And it's so hard to trace it back to where the misinformation started. Like I think one of the examples is I think there was a kind of a like an urban legend level kind of thing where people said the guy who invented Pokemon was autistic.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then somebody traced it back to somebody who misinterpreted something.
Oh, wow.
It took on a life of its own in English.
I mean, that's the tricky thing a lot of times with like anytime a story arrives, whether it's, whether it's manga or Western comics or really anything, is there's often going to be that initial reaction where it's like you kind of have to get past that initial reaction and try to figure out what the real story is underneath sometimes. And like with a lot of this stuff originating in a completely different country and in a completely different language, I imagine that would be a very big complicating factor to what you do.
And I think sometimes the Western media tends to lean upon the, oh God, Japan is so weird angle, right?
Yeah.
And then they'll go, oh, like, oh, Japanese people, they're not having sex anymore, so that's why they don't have children, and that's why blah and blah and blah. And it's like, no, 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 no. That you're interpreting it the way you want to interpret it, but that's not the full story.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's kind of like, if you only went by anime and manga, you would think Japan is a completely different place than it really is.
Hmm.
Kind of like how if you've only watched American movies, you would think, I don't know, you walk out on the street, you're going to get shot, and there's, all kinds of horrible things happening. I deal with that with my relatives. I'm originally from Hawaii. My aunt contacts me all the time and says, "Oh, there was a shooting in blah blah. Are you okay?" It's like, Auntie, I live in Oakland. That's in San Francisco. I'm fine.
Yeah.
And it's like they just get freaked out. So I think I like to go to Japan with a spirit of I really don't know everything, but I'm curious about everything. So when I don't assume I know everything and ask questions, I get some really neat answers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to be open to this stuff. I mean, it's interesting because I mentioned earlier that you have all these hats. You're a journalist, you're an artist, you're a writer, you're a storyboard artist, a consultant. You do work in graphic recording. I'm not gonna lie, I don't even know what graphic recording is. But the thing about all of that, though, is like I imagine a commonality is you have to be open to other perspectives because sometimes the client wants X, sometimes you need to do Y, and if you're not open to that, it's probably going to be limiting to your work, and it's also going to be limiting to you generating the work too.
Mhm. Well, it's being, I think everything comes down. Like I gave a talk the other day at a Stanford University HCI class, Human Computer Interaction class. And the student asked me, it's like, I have a journalism, training. And what am I going to do? There's no journalist jobs out there. And I told her, like, take away the job title. You're a writer. You're a storyteller. You're a listener. You're an observer. That's what the journalism skills are. But those skills are useful in all kinds of other jobs. So don't limit yourself and just only look for journalism jobs look for jobs that are about writing, good writing, or storytelling, or getting information, being a good observer of humanity and or trends, or connecting the dots. These are all transferable skills, and in some cases very useful and lucrative skills.
Yeah. I mean, well, for listeners, we're going to be here to talk about like some of the trends in the manga industry overall. And, as I noted earlier, you're a manga journalist and one of the people. You're actually, one thing I forgot to mention, you're also a podcaster. You're one of the people behind the manga podcast, Manga Splaining. And it's funny. I feel like if someone told me they wanted to know about the world of manga, I would just send them your way because you just know more than everybody else, especially because this is one of the things I think is interesting. And I think it ties into what you were saying about like opportunities and like, somebody who wants to be a journalist and everything. One of the interesting things about writing about manga is it seems like there's kind of a dearth of writing about it. And I sometimes I wonder if that's because sites aren't looking for it or if it's because no one thinks to cultivate more people like you who know things about it, or maybe they just don't have your email and you need to be writing 500 times more than you already are. But I'm curious as to, you've become this kind of expert on manga and the industry and everything like that. What led you down that path? Was it just an interest that continuously expanded into something more?
I'd say that's a good description of it. Let's see, how do I explain this? I mean, I've been reading manga since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Like Hawaii has a really strong Japanese American media culture. We used to have 3 Japanese language movie theaters where my dad took me to see Zatoichi movies. I watched Kikaida and Kamen Rider on TV. This is like in the 70s. So, it's subtitled and whatever, so I didn't really have to learn Japanese. But, this was a part of my world since I was a kid. So, and I got introduced to manga when I was 8 years old, when I went to Japan, and my aunt's friend ran a bookstore and she gave me my first copy of Nakayoshi. And, first taste is free, but so, yeah. So, and I also love to draw. So then, I got into drawing comics and I was interested in it that way. Then later on, I think, I have an art major, studied art, illustration and stuff like that. Then what ended up happening is that I did PR for my friend's art gallery. And then that led to me writing art reviews and feature articles in the daily newspaper in Hawaii. So I had a journalism background a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I got into tech jobs. I worked at Microsoft for a while. And then as a result of working at Microsoft, one of my colleagues there said, "Oh, I have a side hustle. I'm writing for about.com. I'm writing the beauty column. It's really good. It's a really good gig. Like you just write whenever you have time and write articles and you'll make money off of it." So she said, "Just go to about.com and find a topic you like and see if there's anything." And it just happened to have manga.
Oh my God. Amazing.
So I applied and I got it. And then I just started writing that way. I mean, I already had the journalism background. I already had the interest in manga. So that's how that kind of started. That was like 2006. And so, from there, even though I had like this interest in manga, like since then, it's just been this constant process of learning more and more about it, things I didn't know, and things like when I started, I didn't know anything about Boys Love Manga. I didn't know it existed. And so, getting into that and everything by just following my curiosity, I just learned a lot. And that's where I'm at now, where I'm at the point where I almost know too much, but I know I don't know enough. Okay, so for example, when a publisher who wanted to get into manga came up to me, was introduced to me at Emerald City, and they said, "Oh, so how does licensing manga work?" And I go, "Let me tell you something." So I grabbed a pen and I drew like, here are the 4 major publishers: Kodansha, Shueisha, Shogakukan, Kadokawa. And then, it's like, then like this one has a relationship with this one. It's like part ownership, and this one has part ownership, and this one has part ownership, and this one used to do this, and then that close, and then that. And it was just like, the guy just looked at me like he said, "Wow, that's quite the TED Talk you have." And I filled up like 4 sketchbook pages with these diagrams and these history, and go call this guy. And this is the problem with this one. And these particular titles you can't get your hands on because of this reason. And then Heidi said, "You did that for free?" I said, what? No, Heidi. I said, why did you keep the pictures of these sketches you drew for him and these diagrams? I says, what, Heidi? Everybody knows this shit. She goes, no, they don't.
Oh my God. I think that the curiosity thing is really important because I always say that's the biggest driver for my stuff too. And I think that's important for somebody like you because I think the only way you can become an expert on something is by always being curious about the things that you don't really know. Like you could become an expert on like part of something. Like maybe just like you could become an expert on like a single creator or like a single type of genre of manga or something like that. But to like really become a comprehensive expert, you have to have like that thirst for knowledge, that curiosity about like all facets of it. And it seems like that's served you really well.
But I still like that's the thing that like, when Chris introduced me that way, I was like, I kept going, no, not even close. I'm sure it sounded really arrogant because I said, Chris, it's not like there's a lot of me. There's not like there's a lot of competition.
Right.
And it didn't mean that like I'm the only one and come at me, suckers. But kind of more like I think there should be more of me, and there are more of me.
Yeah.
I just happen to be, I don't know, available and visible and. I don't know.
It's interesting because there's been a number of manga booms, as we'll talk about here in a second, but like we're in one of the biggest and most sustained ever. There's been this massive surge in popularity. Do you feel like there's been an equal or at least a matching in time frame surge in interest in writing about manga at the same time?
That's a tough one. I will say that people ask me to write for their outlets, and I say I can't. I'm overbooked. I do have a day job.
You got a lot of hats.
Yeah. And so it's not like I do this full time. I wish I could. But, let's be honest, being a comics journalist is a very poor paying job.
Sure.
So most of us who do it have a side hustle that gives us medical insurance and money to pay the rent and to buy way too much comics. Ooh. You know.
Yeah.
So I guess what I realized though after that panel, and I started doing this on Twitter today, was I just said, hey, if you want to write about manga, just post your name and your portfolio, and I'll put you on a list so I can refer you to these sites who keep asking me to write for them.
Yeah.
And I've kind of considered like doing mentoring, like doing some editing and saying like, hey, this is how you could structure your article a little bit better. You have to think about your audience from a general comics news site is different than your personal blog or your YouTube channel or if you're writing for an anime fan site. Like if you're writing for a general comics audience, you have to think about your audience a little differently and what they want to read and what you can bring to the table and how you can serve your readers' interests. It's a different mindset, and I feel like a lot of the anime manga fandom or the journalism space is very focused on anime, not manga. That's how people some people just come into it from anime first, and the manga is a secondary thought.
Yeah.
Compared to Japan, right? Japan is very much a reading culture. Bookstores are still alive and well. I don't think people realize how big manga is in Japan. Like if you put together what I've seen is if you put together all the manga sales from France, US, Germany, blah, 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 all the world, it's still less than Japan. And even then with America, like even now, like we're hitting record high sales, we're still less than France.
Mm-hmm.
know?
I mean, you had a tweet a little while ago, and I wrote about this for my, I have a Friday column where I write about 10 things I liked or didn't like from the week in news, comics news. And you talked about how Japan, I believe, was down in 2022 relative to 2021. And the thing was, it wasn't because it was a bad year. It was because, like, I don't remember what the number was, but it was like billions of dollars, like an absurd amount of money, like probably the value of the total like comic industry in America. And like, that's the thing that I don't think people realize. Like, that was one of the things that I really took away from my experience of visiting Japan was when you're traveling on a train or you're traveling on like mass transit within like an individual city, everyone's reading manga, or when I was in 2011, playing Nintendo DS. And it was just wild. Like everyone, it wasn't everyone was, I mean, granted, I guess it was before like the peak of the iPhone and everything like that, but everyone was reading or playing Nintendo DS. And like, I don't think people understand how it's not just an interest, it's like almost a constant.
It's very, very typical that you'll see, like, I'd say several corridors of Shibuya Station were taken over by Jujutsu Kaisen billboards. Like, huge swaths of this station had Jujutsu Kaisen advertisements.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was because like Jujutsu Kaisen anime was out, and there's a big scene in Shibuya, like a big fight. But that's thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And this is not rare. And this is not for a movie. It's for the manga.
Mm-hmm.
And it's everywhere. It's like the degree to which manga is ubiquitous in Japan, degree to which it's about everything, not just superheroes or not a certain niche interest. It can be about almost everything. When I was there this past month, I was there about the week before the Blue Giant movie opened. And Blue Giant's about jazz. And there were ads everywhere. We went to a pop-up shop that had all the Blue Giant stuff, as well as stuff from Blue Note Records, Miles Davis t-shirts. Every theater was playing Blue Giant. There was a clothing store that had Blue Giant, like, button-up shirts with a little saxophone. It was everywhere. And Blue Note Records has a tie-in with them. It was incredible. It was like you couldn't turn around, and there was something about the about the Blue Giant movie. You don't see that. I mean, that movie, if and when it comes to America, maybe it'll be one night's showing, if we're lucky.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be on Netflix. I don't even know. But there was Brutus Magazine, which is like your version of GQ, had a feature. They had a special insert comic strip where the main character, Blue Giant, talks about some of his jazz heroes. And it was just for Brutus Magazine. And it was accompanied with this whole article about jazz is pop, and here's what the jazz clubs are like in Japan. The way that it's woven into their everyday life blows people away. And the fact that more than half of the industry is for women content.
Yeah.
I don't think Americans get that.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. The comics crowdfunding platform Zoop has new campaigns launching this March, such as the deluxe hardcover for We Are Scarlet Twilight from Benjamin Morris, which was fully funded in 8 hours, The Other Happy Place from superstar artist Jesse Sharon, Imposter Syndicate from War Rocket Ajax host Matt D. Wilson, and a benefit anthology for Planned Parenthood spearheaded by the legendary Trina Robbins. There are other live campaigns and more to sign up for soon, so check out zoop.gg for more. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop are currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. Well, and I think that's, we're going to, jump into some of the industry stuff now, and we're already there. But I think one of the things that's interesting is my wife has been, we got a subscription to Crunchyroll, and she's been watching the anime, and I bought her some manga for Christmas to try to, build the connection. And she was interested. She asked for it. And the fascinating thing is the one that she really wants is impossible to find. It's Akashic Records of Bastard Magic Instructor, which is apparently a light novel. The first volume is out of print, and it sells for unbelievable amounts of money. It's the cheapest I found was $220, and then yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But the interesting thing about it is my wife has never been interested in Western comics. She's been interested in anime, and now she's reading the manga stuff. I got her Sakamoto Days, and I got her Witch Hat Atelier, and I got her Spy X Family. Yeah, she loves Spy X Family.
Oh, that was a good one.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about it, and I think this is a really underrated part about why both manga and also webtoons, I think webtoons do this really well, is they tap into story types and genres that younger people of today, but also people like my wife, women, are looking for better than Western comics do. You wrote a piece for Publishers Weekly called Manga is Booming, and you talked about how adult romance, particularly boys love and girls love manga, has been thriving, and that's not even really a genre that exists in Western comics for the most part. And I don't know, that this all strikes me as an important aspect as to why they're so popular in Japan, but also why they're becoming so big in America. They offer a lot of readers stories that they can't get otherwise. How much of a factor do you think that broader mix of genres is to their overall popularity?
As far as here?
Yeah. I guess we'll shift the focus to America for now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people love good stories.
Right.
It's revelatory to them when they can find a story that really, that they can fall in love with, right? Sometimes I think about how in around the 70s or so, comics for girls just kind of died out in America, right? The romance comics, and they just kind of died out. And then for years, it was kind of this desert, right? There was maybe a few comics for girls, or there was the comics you could give to your girlfriend, like ElfQuest or Sandman or whatever, right? And then people just kind of say, oh, girls don't like comics. It's not a girl thing. And then here comes Sailor Moon,
Yeah.
and all these other books, right? And there was a long period where manga in America was stuff that had a Venn diagram that overlapped with American comic book shops, right? Sci-fi, fantasy, action, all very seinen or very adult male focused content. Then of course anime started showing up in the Sailor Moon anime and then the Sailor Moon manga. And then all of a sudden it was like, wow, they would discover it and girls were like, comics are for me too. And not to say that it was only girls who read Sailor Moon, but it was just kind of this untapped market, right? And then it just grew and grew and grew. And I feel like a lot of the girls who fell in love with Sailor Moon and those comics back then in like the late 90s are now comics creators. And they are in the industry and they're fans, they're lifelong fans. So that's a case of where like the comics industry here said, why bother with women, right? They don't like the stuff we make. It's like, well, how about making stuff they like?
Whoa, Deb, come on.
No, I mean, but the industry was so male focused, right? So of course they were going to make comics they personally liked and they thought other people like them liked. And it's like, and then there was like, like Minx, for example, right? Like, oh, let's make comics for girls. But I'm going to say the Minx line was so after school special life lessons. And here's what you should do, kids, to be good. It's like, no. We want trash. We want rip-roaring, funny trash. Ranma 1/2. Delightful trash. It still makes me laugh to this day.
You know what's funny? I was just in San Antonio visiting family. My wife, she's actually from Hawaii, and her mom's family is all in Maui, and like they've lived everywhere because her dad was in the Air Force, and they settled in San Antonio. And we were visiting San Antonio, and on a bed watching Crunchyroll was my wife, my niece who's 9, and myself. And it was funny. I mean, like that's the thing I think is really interesting. And you had a really fantastic thread about this on Twitter. There's these classifications. There's like shoujo manga, there's, shonen manga, and et cetera, et cetera. There's all these classifications. But just because something exists in one of these doesn't mean that that's going to be the totality of the audience. Here's where I'm going to tell you a fun fact about me. One of my favorite manga adaptations ever, it's so cheesy, is an adaptation of I believe it was a shoujo manga called Good Morning Call that was done on Netflix. That's live action. And I was like so addicted to it. I was like heavily invested in like these characters. There's a character in it named Uehara who they keep like, he's like this love interest and they keep describing him as having a scar on his heart. To this day, I keep saying things like our cat Kubo has a scar in his heart because he's kind of like an Uehara type. And it's funny because like in America, they would assume that somebody like me would not be interested in something like that. But the thing is there's like a blurred line come in with manga because like anything can be for anyone. It just depends on if you discover it.
When I was writing that thread, it kind of started out like people being shocked and amazed that some of Junji Ito's work was published in shoujo manga magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can that be? Then I said, like, okay, here's my methodology, right? Like, I look at the source magazine, and that seems to be a reliable way of figuring out who the target audience was. But as I kind of went through that conversation, I realized it's not that Japan is weird. It's just that American publishing somehow got it in their head that men don't like reading romantic stories. and somehow got it in their head that anything with male protagonists is somehow not going to be interesting to women. It's like, oh, people have been struggling with this, right? Like, why is this romantic series in Shonen Jump? Because guys can like a romantic story too.
Yeah.
And they are different than the shoujo romances, granted. But I think it's just it made me realize that it's Western comics that is so stratified. Here's what's appropriate for kids. Here's what's appropriate for teens, and here's what's appropriate for adults. And in seinen manga in particular, which I've discovered, and kind of my working theory is that it is the ultimate playground of storytelling creativity, where anything goes. You can make it all ages. You can make it super violent. You can make it super slice of life and fun and romantic. Anything goes, and that creates all kinds of interesting stories. So that's my preferred manga reading when I get a magazine. Is I love seinen manga because it gives me such an interesting menu of ideas and art styles and stories, and I think that it respects the audience. Like if you love comics, you'll love good stories. They don't have to be gendered, right?
No. I mean, that's one of the things I always think is really interesting about and I understand why it happens, because it's helping booksellers or librarians and stuff like that, where it's like, this book is for 8 to 13-year-old girls. And I'm just like, that is such a narrow band. And like, a book, I'm actually doing a podcast tomorrow with Erica Henderson and Ryan North, who have an upcoming book called Danger and Other Unknown Risks, which is a YA book that's for, I think, like teens and YA. But it's interesting because like in the same way that like Pixar or like Miyazaki are really for everyone, that book is for everyone. But I want to talk about the adaptation thing, because I think that's an important part of this. And I'm going to use that as a jump off to talk about the larger manga market in the United States, because it's been crazy. Like the 2020 was a big year for sales. 2021 was insane, with that jumping, I believe, by like 171% over the previous year. 2022 has been even higher, up 9% on those numbers. From what I understand, both from your writing and also just conversations I've had with people, it seems like the adaptations are actually driving people back to the manga. Is that a big part of what's driving this kind of recent sustained boom in manga?
Well, anime is a big driver, of course, of manga sales in America, period.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to say that's the only driver. For example, Witch Hat Atelier, which is very popular, has no anime yet. People just love it because there's a lot of buzz about it. People read it. The art's great. The story's great.
It's so beautiful.
And then once there's a great word of mouth, right? All it takes is something like that for people to get turned on to something. Anime still continues to be a big driver because, America's a TV watching culture.
Actually, a really good example of what you're saying is Chainsaw Man just became an anime, right? It just became an anime, and it was a massive hit.
Yeah, and it was a massive hit before the anime because Tatsuki Fujimoto tells a really different story. I mean, it's a shonen manga, right? But it's dark, and it's also funny, and it's weird, and it's got, in funny, weird action pack, but then it's got these moments where you're like, oh, just hits you. He's a great storyteller, and he's very young. What I love about that, that type of story is that, sometimes there's tropes in, American comics and media, right? Oh, this is act 1, act 2, the hero's going to have this crisis, and then they're going to have a redemption arc, blah, 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 right? Things are kind of going to go a certain way. If you've consumed any kind of storytelling as a, consumer, movies, books, comics, you get used to these story beats. The manga I love the most doesn't do that. It does something fresh. It does something different. And you're like, oh, I didn't expect that, or one thing that happens is like, maybe sometimes I don't think people realize this, but you fall in love with the characters and you fall in love with their chemistry and you fall in love with who they are as people. And that such that you want to buy the goods that have their face on it, right? Because you're like, I like this guy. I like this character. This character's so cool. Whereas like, I don't feel the same about some comics that I read in America. Like, oh, yeah, Dogman. Cool. I'm not like running out, I must have a Dogman plushie. However, I want a Pochita plushie.
Yeah, he's got a chainsaw on his head.
Right? It's so cute.
I mean, what's not to like? Yeah, it is. That's the funny thing about that character is it rides the perfect line between like super intense and utterly adorable. I had a writer in comics here, James Tynan. He has this like his prevailing theory that that's part of the reason why manga is like, and I don't want to quote him, I'm paraphrasing, but prevailing theory that why manga is doing so much better than Western comics is just like the characters look amazing. When you see like Chainsaw Man stuff, or if you see like Demon Slayer characters and stuff like that, you kind of want to know like what's going on with these characters, and you just get driven to watch the anime or read the manga or whatever. But I mean, going back to it, like, what do you, beyond the adaptation side, like, what do you view as the big drivers for like the sustained boom we're kind of in?
Mm, I mean, I would say that sometimes it is, like I think manga and now webtoons are scratching some people's itch for like the stories they've always wanted to read.
Yeah.
Like with webtoon, for example, in America, the vast majority of the readership, and from what I understand, is younger women.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, the heavy majority of the stories are romance driven or fantasy driven or
slice of life.
But then when I look at in Japan, the top 10 webtoon series are an equal mix of action, drama, and romance. It's not as skewed. So it made me kind of think like, webtoons giving a certain demographic here what they're not getting from manga. And so much like the ants on my kitchen table, they will go where something attractive is. They'll come out of the woodworks and just go where something is. And they'll tell each other, go here. It'll has what you want. So sometimes what I guess the hypothesis I'm coming up to now is manga can't be complacent. Webtoons coming up fast.
I mean, it is really interesting. My wife's a good friend who was served Instagram ads for Webtoon when 2020, like peak of the pandemic and everything, and she was just on her phone and she got served an ad for Lore Olympus. And next thing you know, she is like a million episodes deep. And it's interesting because that's two things that I think it does well. It's serving an audience that's underserved, and they're actually telling people about it, which doesn't seem like a radical thing, but it really is in comics sometimes.
Mm-hmm. They give you that weekly hit.
Yeah.
And they also serve it up, not by $8.99 per volume that you got to wait 3 months for. It is a new chapter every week that is, you can pay in coins, which is funny money, or it's free if you wait. Like they have all kinds of really innovative ways to get you hooked and keep you coming back for more. I mean, I'm interested in this because I'm also in user experience design and e-commerce. I'm also looking at their user experience and how it's very smooth, and that like the whole checkout is really smooth, and the way that they keep you coming back for more and make you feel engaged. Like one thing I really love about Webtoon is that it's in seasons, so that it gives an artist a break, and at the end of a series, at the end of the season, there'll be like this chapter where the artist is talking back to you and saying, "Hey, thanks for reading. Oh my God, this was so stressful because, I was moving house and then this and I got sick. But, I powered through because I really wanted to finish this." And then they'll give sketches and they'll say like, "Oh, there's my favorite moment from this scene. This was so hard to draw, but, like this is the favorite moment when, the characters do this." Or they'll give background information about the character that you didn't know, or they'll draw them as younger characters. Like, "Oh, here's your favorite characters when they were elementary school." And it's so delightful because it's this. And then they'll answer questions from fans that they got through social media. It's so delightful. Maybe in some manga, like they'll have like a little commentary from the author, like Kohei Horikoshi in the first volume of My Hero Academia, like, "Well, I'm giving it my best shot and I hope you love it." And he's kind of saying like, because his previous series got canceled. So you're like, "Oh, honey, you don't even know what you're in for."
I do think you're tapping into something that's pretty important to this too, is I think price and accessibility are really important. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, the print volumes are normally very reasonably priced, unless it's that aftermarket Akashic Records volume. And like the place you start is just the first volume. But also on top of that, when you're talking about, I think Shonen Jump, I think it was supposed to raise to $2.99 a month, and I think it's still $1.99 when I looked at it last. And there's that, which is like unbelievably priced. Unbelievably. Yeah. And then on top of that, it's like Webtoon. It's like, if you just want to read for free, you can just read for free. Mm-hmm. How important do you think those two aspects, like price and accessibility, are in terms of kind of driving this boom?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think adults like us forget when you're under 16, you don't have a credit card.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, and you don't have a lot of money. So, like, unless you're stupid rich or your parents give you a $50 allowance every week. But, buying that one volume of manga is a lot. My theory, too, was that a lot of piracy was due to people saying, I'm poor. I can't afford this. But, what happened, what's interesting that I'm seeing, right, is there's webtoon books that are practically free to read or mostly free to read on the apps. People are buying the books.
Oh, yeah.
And then like Shonen Jump, sure, you can get $1.99 a month, but people are buying the books. So it kind of says people are happy to use the digital to get into the story, to get the latest chapters, to stay on top of it. But that doesn't stop them from buying the book, So I think that was interesting because in the early days, Japan was very tight-fisted about digital. Like, oh no, if we put our stuff online, people are going to steal it. Oh no, we have to, make sure that people don't screenshot anything. They're going to steal things. And believe you me, that still happens. But now I think it's kind of been proving that digital is not going to kill print sales. And in fact, digital makes a lot of things possible. The marketing cycle here in America is like 8-9 months. Like a book gets ready to go to the printer. It needs like 8-9 months in the whole marketing, pre-order, blah, 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 distribution cycle till it actually gets in the hands of a reader. And so digital gives it like, yeah, same day as Japan. You can read it and you can enjoy it. And that kind of blunts a lot of the piracy. I think it just took Japan a while to realize that digital is not a net negative. In fact, digital now has surpassed print in Japan. The convenience can't be beat.
Well, and I do think that one of the things that makes a lot of sense about manga is when you look at it from like top to bottom, when you look at all aspects of like, you start with the manga and then you have like the digital version, which is more inexpensive, but it kind of acts as like a loss leader that drives people to print. But then on top of that, the anime itself is the same story that they're telling in the manga. So it's like, if you want more, can't wait for that next season, you better go buy the print. And it's interesting that all facets of the product kind of lead to the print product in a lot of ways. And that's a really interesting thing that is majorly different between like manga and Western comics is there's a really, I mean, I don't know for sure that it's their plan for all these things to work like that, but it seems like there's a very cohesive plan that manga publishers have on how they can grow their audience and get more people buying.
The secret of it is one creator, one story. Or one creative team, one story for the entire run of the series, right? Whereas, like One Piece Volume 1 to One Piece Volume 100, all written and drawn by Eiichiro Oda and his cast of assistants. But it is one story. The characters remain the same. They grow up, of course. They evolve a little bit. But in their hearts, their essence of these characters stays the same from beginning to end. And you fall in love with them. You fall in love with their growth. Whereas I hate to pick on American comics, but you can fall in love with a certain version of a character written by a certain creative team, and that'll all get negated with the next creative team. Like all of a sudden, this character you love goes evil,
Yeah.
or all of a sudden, this couple that you're really rooting for breaks up. Somebody dies, and then it comes back to life, and it's like don't play with me like this, American comics. That's disrespectful.
It's very true. I just have to throw this out there. How do you think I started reading manga?
Ooh, good question. What was your gateway drug?
It's right there. There's a lot of it.
Oh, 20th Century Boys?
20th Century Boys from the library. That was the library was my gateway. Yeah, Anchorage, Alaska has this library called the Lusac Library, and they have a massive manga collection to have for years and years and years. And there's two different sections. It's funny that it's split like this. This speaks to your American stratification. There's a section that's in the adults, and then there's this place called the teen zone, which is where a lot of like the shonen and shoujo stuff is. And like my wife has all these pictures of me standing in the teen zone with her on the other side of the door, and it says teen zone on there, and I'm just looking like this weirdo, and I'm holding like Naoki Urasawa or like, other books and stuff. And it's really funny that like I don't know. I mean, like that's the thing that I think that manga has done a really good job of is like they are where people are. and they don't niche themselves because they're trying to not be a niche. And I think that that's really meaningful in terms of how people engage with it.
So tell me what made you get hooked on 20th Century Boys? What did you love about it?
Well, so first off, I heard a lot of really good things, and it was like I just heard a lot of recommendations, and so I was like, I'll try this out. And then I started reading it. I was like, oh my god! And first off, the art is unbelievable. I mean, it's just like the thing. I really love character acting in art, and he's just unbelievable with all the cast. And it has such a big cast, and like I love every single one of them. I once did a 20th Century Boys power ranking of the cast, ranking it, and I think I ended up tie. I think I ended up having a tie at the top. But there's just so many characters I love, and the funny thing about it is about 20th Century Boys is the fact that like initially like I was really interested in like the identity of who like the big bad was and like
Friend was, yeah.
but by the end of it I just like I wanted to know that these characters were going to be okay. And it's like, isn't that kind of funny? I was like so invested in them. And it was really funny how my relationship with it kind of evolved where I was like, I gotta know about this mystery, and I'm like, I gotta make sure Kanji's okay. Oh my god. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. So 20th Century Boys, but I mean that led me to Monsters right there, and I got like I love all of his stuff, and I keep going from there. But it is interesting. I had a question about like the nature of how America relates to manga though, because there was a manga boom of the early 2000s. We're in a manga boom now. There were probably others in there. Why are they always booms?
Well, it kind of gains steam, right? People get into it, and then people see that there's money in it, and then more people come into the market, right? Like at the last boom, it was like manga's doing so well, and so other smaller publishers jumped into the fray.
Yeah,
put in, publish things, and more people publish stuff, and then there was a recession and borders collapsed, and everyone, a bunch of companies went out of business, and there was layoffs, and so some of that was not a manga fault. Some of it was just larger economic factors. But then, the manga starts again, right? All the manga publishers are being quite this, and because they have the memory of that, right? Because at that last manga boom, it was kind of like, let's just publish manga, and it was all kinds of manga of varying quality, right? There's a lot of clunkers out there. And it's like, or let's make some kind of weird manga version of an American comic that was pretty lame. So there were all kinds of things that were thrown at the wall, and there was some pretty mediocre stuff that just flooded the market. And if you're a comic book store and you've ordered this stuff and you can't sell it, you can't return it. So that was, that created some this manga stuff. I don't know what to do with it. And then, of course, there's also relations to whether anime is on TV or not. Like if there's Toonami and stuff like that, sure, boom. If there's not, boom, right? So part of what the going theory with manga now is there's more anime than ever, right?
Right.
Crunchyroll, Hulu, Amazon, Netflix, more anime than ever, more accessible than ever, more variety than ever. And that introduces people to manga. And then you also got the fact that, since that last boom and now, there are more manga libraries. There are more librarians who are more savvy about manga and putting it in their collection. Almost every librarian I've talked to says, that's the stuff that goes in and out like crazy. So, that even more reasons for people to get exposed to manga, right? It's at the library, pick it up. Ooh, that's neat. So there's so many more touch points in which people can read manga. I saw manga at Target.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere at Target.
There's manga at Walmart. There's so many more touch points than there were before. So I can't speak for everybody, but when I first encountered manga, I was hooked. And so I feel like it just kind of builds and builds and builds. But what's happening here too is not just that first group of manga boomers, that first generation of people who read manga, they're still here. Some of them are still here. And so their tastes have grown. They still continue to read stuff. And then they have kids, and then they have friends. And it's just kind of becoming more like once upon a time, the word manga was a foreign loan word, right? Nobody knew what it meant. Like at once upon a time, sushi was a foreign loan word. Nobody knew what it meant. But now you know what it means. So it just kind of gets into the vocabulary. Like people know shonen manga, they know shoujo manga. They may not know seinen or josei, and that's okay. But like once upon a time, they had to flip manga to make it read like American comics. They tried to color it to make it look more like American comics. They tried to sell it in little floppy comics so they would sell an American comic shop. And we're now here, 20, 30 years later, when it's like manga is manga. It's the way it was in Japan. It is reading, right to left. It doesn't need to be flopped. It doesn't need to be colored. And sometimes it has some very Japanese content that culturally maybe you wouldn't expect people to understand. But there's manga about shogi, which is Japanese chess. One of my favorites in Shonen Jump now is about rakugo, akane banashi. I mean, I didn't even know about rakugo until maybe 5 years ago. Like, what is this? Oh, it's a kind of Japanese storytelling where there's only one guy on the stage and he's using a fan and then he's doing both the voices of the women and the men and blah, blah, blah. And you're just supposed to imagine how amazing the story is just by this guy's storytelling. Like, aha, okay. And then, Showa Rakugo, there's called Descending Stories. That's an anime on Crunchyroll, but it's also a manga. It's kind of like an Ozu film. It's really amazing, multi-generational story about this Rakugo family. And then Akane Banashi is like in Shonen Jump. It's about a girl whose father was a Rakugo storyteller, and she decides to get into it herself. And it's super well done, really compelling. So these are things that years ago would have been, this is a no-go, right? This is too Japanese. American people aren't going to understand it. And now it's so much more open and so much more expansive. And we're getting, I think, manga like My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, which is a diary comic. Normally that wouldn't have come over years ago. Oh, the art's a little weird. Oh, the content's a little controversial. It's a huge seller. It won a Harvey Award. So I think we as Americans, our manga taste has evolved. It's maturing.
Yeah.
And we're more ready than ever to take more that what Japan can give to us, willing to give to us. And it'll still be the tip top of the iceberg of what's out there in Japan.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's Bad Idea Comics, and surprising absolutely no one, the renegade director-retailer publisher that's always doing wild things is again doing wild things. Not satisfied to just drop comics like Matt Kint, Ramon Villalobos, and Tamara Bonville's They're All Terrible, or Matt Kint and Louis LaRosa's Megalith the old-fashioned way, they've continued to drop their Secret Six titles, or comics they make incredibly difficult to find by being sneaky about it, with Playtime, a new comic from the great Mike Carey and Jonathan Weishak that they dropped at Comics Pro. What might be next? Who knows? It's Bad Idea. They're crazy. Keep an eye out, or you might miss the next Bad Idea comic altogether. And now, back to the show. I do think it's interesting. One of the things you brought up in that Manga is Booming piece I'd mentioned earlier was that I forgot who it was, but somebody had mentioned the fact that one of the top sellers was Attack on Titan's first volume, something that had come out more than 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think that's interesting about that accessibility aspect is that there's almost like a time shifted element to it, where it's like I could go and read I don't know, Nausicaa or something like that. And that came out decades ago. And that's something that I wouldn't have been able to maybe access 15 years ago, but now I can. Mm. Or I can get 20th Century Boys, and then I can also get Pluto, and I can get Monster, and I can get all these things. I can go through his entire library. And the accessibility has allowed books that are not currently new, quote unquote new, to become big hits again because they're new to you, to the American audience. And I think that that's really interesting.
Well, in France, right? Last year, one of the big sellers, Naruto Volume 1.
Yeah, there you go.
Naruto should be discovered by generations upon generations, like how Wizard of Oz gets discovered or The Outsiders gets discovered by generation upon generation. Great stories should always be available to readers. And, we shouldn't think that, just got to keep bringing out new stuff. And new stuff, you need some of the classics too.
I do think it's kind of tricky. One of the things you wrote about in that piece was about how it wasn't just the top sellers like the Jujutsu Kaisens and the Tokyo Revengers and Spy X Families and everything that were really moving. It was there's a deep bench of options for readers of all varieties. Do you think, I in that piece I did for Publishers Weekly, Patrick Brower, a retailer from Chicago's Challengers Comics and Conversation, he told me that one of the difficulties they've run into is the fact that there's so many new first volumes coming out in manga that it's getting increasingly difficult for them to kind of figure out which ones are going to sell, while there's ones that they know will sell, like the Spy X Families and the Demon Slayers and everything like that. Do you think that there's a balance that needs to be reached when it comes to like the number of like titles coming out, or do you think that that's kind of something that the industry just sorts out on its own because of sales and everything?
Well, that's a tough one, right? I think maybe one of the problems is that manga, the form factor of manga is a book that is X many, like maybe 3/4 inches thick, right? On a shelf. And space is finite. So, it's not, and it takes up more space than your average floppy comic in a long box. And you're dealing with the fact that as a comic book retailer, you're thinking, who's my customer, right? Who's coming in? Do I get the latest and greatest, or do I keep the evergreen hits in? But how do I keep the fans who keep coming every week to see what's new? I think it's just exacerbated by the comic shop direct market thing, where they can't return it. And I think the other thing that exacerbates it is a lot of, and I'm not saying all, but I am saying that, there are people who run these shops who don't really like or know much about manga. And so it's hard for them to know what to stock if it's something they don't personally love. And I'm deeply sympathetic to this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to say because their dynamic is so different.
There's a shop in Dublin, Big Bang Comics. And when I was looking for manga to buy for my wife, I went to their resident manga expert, JP Jordan. Shouts to JP. And you should have seen it. It was like, oh, my wife likes these things. What do you think would be a good recommendation? He gave me this like Twitter DM that was like a mile long. And it was like, well, if she's feeling like this, here's all these things and yada, yada, yada. And it was amazing. And the thing is for Big Bang, they're booming when it comes to manga. They're thriving with manga. And it helps when you have that subject matter expert in-house that can guide people to the right manga series for them.
Mm-hmm. It's like being a sommelier, honestly.
Oh yeah. Ooh, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. You can start with white wine goes with fish and red wine goes with steak. But if you're deep, you can go, if you like this movie, then you would definitely like this type of manga.
Mm-hmm. Gotta know it.
Somebody has to be like invested in having read some of the stuff. And I mean, I love this stuff, but I don't read everything. I can't. It's once upon a time I could read every manga that came out. That is not possible now. But I have my definite taste, and I think that's partly why I try to, that's why I'm still on social media, even though people, have go like, oh, I'm not on Twitter anymore. Twitter's too negative. It's like, no, this is how I stay on top of things. I start noticing what people are talking about a lot. It allows me to stay in touch with what's happening in Japan, what people are talking about there. It's lets me have my feelers out to like, oh, I should pay attention to this versus reading everything that comes about. And then, there are things that I discover that I will talk up. Like, I don't know, I'm probably the only person in America who's reading Giant Killing, the soccer manga. But I love it.
I just want to say, as a person who is a longtime advocate for the fact that there should be more sports and food comics in Western comics, that's one thing I really appreciate about manga is they got sports and food comics.
It's really, and I'm not a sports person, but I love Giant Killing because it's about a protein. The players are like anywhere from their early 20s to their mid 30s.
Mm-hmm.
They're all in various stages of deciding, where they're going with their career. Whether they can be a total underdog team and whether their coach can help them find their own potential to work together as a team. So it's kind of like a business comic in a way because it's also about management.
Mm-hmm.
Management and about your career and like at what point are you psyching yourself out of success.
You're really selling me on this book right now. It's
really great. It's like Haikyuu, of course I love but it's a grown-up series and there's things that come up for me in Giant Killing and then when they do win you're like, oh, it's so breathtaking.
Yeah,
I love it.
One thing I think is really interesting about manga too is I feel like a lot of times with American comics, they get addicted to these big, crazy ideas There's like, you want to be saying something, or you want to have this complex story and everything like that. And I think that one underrated part about the appeal of manga, like, granted, a lot of this is based off of engaging with my wife and like the anime she's watching and everything like that. But there's so many ones that are like basic idea plus fantasy idea equals something she's going to love. She is watching multiple shows about demon schools.
Oh,
And they're all like demon school, where it's like there's a human that's going to the demon school, or there's this and it's going to the demon school. And it's always like there's like a variation on stories we're already familiar with, but with this like kind of fantasy twist. And I feel like the hooks are always so quick and obvious for people to kind of pick up when it comes to manga. Like, do you feel like that's a factor to some degree?
well, there's that current trend where like the entire hook of the story is in the title.
Oh,
right?
oh yeah. There's some really long titles, right?
Like suppose some kid from the last boony town, from the last town becomes like a hero, Or
Yeah.
like I am an overworked office worker and I came back, but now I'm going to save the world with my office management skills. I made up the last one, but you kind of get the idea. Like
like the way of the house husband and
yeah. Like Way of the House Husband. It's like if it had a normal title, it'd be like I married a yakuza and he now cleans my house. So some of these titles are ridiculous. Like there's one about like reborn in another world as a vending machine. Like that's one where the office worker gets reborn as a talking vending machine and he travels to the dungeons strapped to the back of a busty elf.
You are selling me on so many books. I don't even know what's going on with that, but I am all about it.
Right. And I just love this, the gleeful stupidity of it all. Like Delicious and Dungeon. Freaking brilliant, right?
Yeah.
Like these group of adventurers go into a dungeon. They're kind of short on funds, so they decide they're going to eat what they kill in the dungeon rather than bringing in provisions. And so it's like a cooking manga.
Oh my God.
But then
it's amazing. It's so funny how they do that. It's smart though, because it's like you can say some of these titles and like all of a sudden I'm like, wait, hold on a second, can I write that down so I can read this later? But I just have a few more questions for you.
Of course.
I did want to ask about like one of the interesting aspects of the big boom, particularly in 2021, was that the supply chain was just struggling during that period. Like I remember I kept getting in. I'm friends with a shop in Tel Aviv, Jacob Sorelli from the Kamikaze in Tel Aviv. Yeah. He sent me a before and after picture of basically like they got their shipment in, and then just like a few days later, it's like almost everything was gone. And then they were like, I don't know when we're going to get this back in. And the interesting thing about that was it was such a massive year, but it also had a cap on it because of the supply chain issues. I have a theory. Like, do you think that in some ways the supply chain issues may have like low key had a positive impact because, if I could have gotten Chainsaw Man then, instead of it constantly being sold out, it might have seemed like maybe a little bit less desirable. I imagine that the downside is significantly more than that upside I laid out, but I do kind of wonder sometimes like how big of an impact the supply chain really did, because it seems like it could have like a comprehensive impact that we don't really understand.
I think you're onto something. Of course, I do believe that they would have sold even more manga if it was available, right? If the supply chain wasn't an issue, they probably would have sold 300%. Demand was that high. But also, too, I think you've got a point, like to bring it to like a completely random Hawaii metaphor. In the 70s, we had a dock strike, and that meant toilet paper was in short supply. So everybody had to, when you went to the store and you needed to get toilet paper, it was like limit one per person. I remember standing in line with my one package. My brother had his one package. My mom had her one package. It created this mania about getting your hands on your supply of toilet paper because it was scarce. To this day, Hawaii people are manic about toilet paper, and stocking up and making sure that there's a lot. So I think that is, and so what I see now on social media a lot with a lot of the manga vloggers is they are showing off their manga collection, or they're unboxing their manga collection, or like, look how many I bought. And they're like, it's like they're like, I caught a deer, mom, kind of thing. So
it's like the people with their trophy fish, like right. It's like, look, I got this big bass.
And everyone's like, oh, you got that one? That one's been out of print for days. Oh, and they're like,
yeah, it's the FOMO. Yeah. It's the fear of missing out.
So I think you're right in that it has created this, I guess, this mentality of collecting getting and completing a collection. And it's so strange because there's an aftermarket for out of print manga,
Don't I know it?
but it's not in Overstreet. So it's not really on comic retailers' radar that sometimes they've got something rare and expensive. It's really strange.
It's also based off of actual demand too, though, because it's not like a magazine said that this comic is worth $200. It's because that's literally what it's going for.
Well, yeah. I mean, sometimes these prices are exaggerated because
Sure.
they'll put it out there. But the part is that just adds to the appeal, right? Like, I got a copy of Blackjack number 14, and that's going for $500 on eBay. Nanny, nanny, you know?
One interesting part about it is like to tie into that piece I did for Publishers Weekly. This wasn't about manga, but a bookseller from Brooklyn's powerhouse bookstore, Brittany Jarvis, said that kids in particular love series. They love series, and they like if it's like a larger, easy to follow series, it's more likely to succeed than a standalone book. And I do wonder sometimes if that's a big part of manga. And it's like, especially in how it appeals to younger readers, is that when you get into one of these books, it's not just like I'm going to have one volume of, I don't know, Chainsaw Man or something like that. It's going to be a series, and you're going to be able to continue to read it, and it's like it becomes like this habit. It becomes this part of your life that's regular. Do you think that like that basically constantly serialized nature is a big part of manga's appeal?
I think that's a part of it, but also to these extremely good cliffhangers,
Yeah.
right? Like, they're really masterful at this kind of storytelling. Like, they get you so you think, oh, what's going to happen next in One Piece? Oh my God, what is, what's going to happen with a Deku and what My Hero Academia? How is he going to get out of this? Wait till next week. And whereas I think with the American stuff, and Raina Telgemeier, right? She sells a ton of books. She's just one woman, and maybe she puts out a book every year and a half, right? So that it's kind of like if it's a really good story, you want to keep going. And sometimes some of these books come with like already three volumes in the can. Or I used the pandemic to catch up and read all of One Piece. Completely rewarding. I have no regrets, but that was 100-something volumes in it.
I was going to say, isn't that like really, really long?
It took me 6 months.
I had a friend in comics gift me the first 2 volumes of Berserk several years ago, and I was just like, what have you got me into? It's so long.
It is long, but like for example, so I did both, right? Like I would read One Piece, and then I would watch the anime of that chapter, and I go back and read the manga and then watch the anime of that chapter. So it was kind of complementary. They worked together. I mean, of course, there were some filler episodes, but they worked together. And this is a stereotype, but yeah, you can start with One Piece Volume 1 and keep going. But there's also great one-shots, and that's fine too. I mean, it is sad that like Kentaro Miura died.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a sad thing because that's the downside with the one artist, one story thing, right? So when he dies, like, how's the story going to continue? Did it get finished? And I think that's something they're working out now. His assistants, and they're trying to finish the story as based on what, the notes he left behind. Same thing with Hunter x Hunter. The artist is dealing with some very serious health issues. And he can only put out a chapter every couple weeks or months. But people are hanging on like, oh my God. And One Piece is kind of on its last arc, but who knows? That could be for another 6 years, right?
My wife was watching like I think one of her gateways when she was growing up in Japan, she was watching a lot of like anime and everything. But one of her modern gateways was she was watching Bleach on Adult Swim, I think. And that went away for a while and then it just came back, right? And so it's like the end is not always the end. It can be a temporary end. I think one of the amazing things about manga storytellers is like you look at any of like the stuff I have behind me, it's being serialized as chapters in like anthology to start with, and then it's being collected into the tankobons, and then it's being collected into other volumes and stuff like that. And the interesting thing is, you said the cliffhangers, they're writing for multiple audiences at once and like different reading experiences at once, which makes for a completely different way to create stories. And that's really remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah, I think like if you've listened to the Manga Explain episodes about Akira, it is seamless. Like you when you read Akira, you don't see that a chapter began and a chapter ended. It's a seamless story. Whereas in a lot of manga, you'll see like, oh, here's the title page for this chapter. Here's the title page for this chapter. Go back into Akira. It is seamless end-to-end storytelling. And then there's a whole other, if you buy the box set, there's a whole separate book called Akira Club, which is all the title pages from the serialization. It's really remarkable because sometimes you're thinking like, wait, where did he cut this off for the chapter? Because it just kind of flows like one long story that he wrote beginning to end. It's a dense read, but it's very rewarding to go back to it.
I think that one thing that I think is interesting and kind of goes back to the time shifting thing is like, because so many American readers are new to manga, you can go, it's like there's good manga and there's bad manga, just like there's good and bad anything. But the thing is like for so many of these readers who are new to it, like you can just skim off the top and you could be going for years just reading and like you would still not even get to the stuff that's like not even good anymore. It's just kind of mediocre or something like that. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things, like that time shifting element is like a lot of these readers will just keep discovering stuff and keep discovering stuff and keep discovering stuff without even having to get to the new stuff. And that's really incredible.
Well, that's what's really been fun about manga explaining, right? It's like it was started because we all went to Japan in 2019 together. It was me, Chip, Chris, David Brothers, Nick Dragotta. We all went to Japan together. I dragged poor Chip out to Sendai to the Shotaro Ishinomori museums where, he's the common writer and stuff like that. And we dragged him on all kinds. We went to Nakano Broadway to see like the Mandarake and see the, all the halls of manga and collectibles.
He's the newer one to the mix, right? Like he's newer to manga. Yeah.
Yeah. So he didn't know much about manga at all. So he's like, what are you guys talking about? And then he also kind of would say stuff like, oh, I went to Mandarake and I realized how small my world is compared to manga. Like, look at all this work that's been created. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And my work is nowhere near, nowhere to be seen. So then we, because we're all good friends, we started this. And it's been so delightful because Chip brings a really interesting perspective to the mix. Like he's the ingenue where he's like, wait, why is this? And what is this? But he'll surprise us because he'll love something. And I'll think, I didn't think you would. I didn't expect that you would like a romance about a married woman and a single woman discovering they're attracted to each other. Or I didn't think you would love a story about a young woman and an older woman in her 70s discovering their love of boys love manga together. He surprises me all the time. And then we all kind of pick different books just to keep it fresh and different, right? So I think David was talking about this where we say, oh well, Deb picks out all the Criterion Collection books, right? Like all the manga you must read. It's the best of the best, the cream of the crop. And he says, I'm here as a spoiler. I'm going to throw in some wild stuff into the mix. He did Raw Hero, which is probably the wildest, weirdest superhero comic you're ever going to read. Baki, which is a super intensely violent and over-the-top fighting manga. We just did Under Ninja, which is about like a guy who is like this underemployed ninja. And then he still has these ninja skills, but he's living in kind of poverty and he kind of has to scrape by. Then this Russian guy comes to town looking for ninjas because he wants to be a ninja. And it's wild. So David brings his own taste in the mix. And then Chris, of course, brings, kind of somewhere between me and David. And then I kind of feel obliged to bring in the girl stuff because I'm outnumbered.
And Chip's just got giant eyes the whole time about all of it. It's amazing.
He's kind of like, we're like 90 episodes in, and now I think he's pretty good about the manga thing.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. But we might have to get somebody new.
Manga explaining is another example as to why it pays to be curious, whether you're Chip or yourself. But Deb, that is actually all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about manga, the industry, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with manga journalist Deb Aoki. You can find her on Twitter at Deb Aoki, on her website at debaoki.com, and her writing at Publishers Weekly. Thanks again to Deanna Chapman for editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Darcy Van Polges, Kevin Bides, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Christo Ray, Near Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Cancel Comics, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Stein IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submen Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Massell, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grumbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Chris Rata, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the song's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.